Okay, well, it sounds like everyone maybe has had a chance to introduce themselves. Just some quick context for today's meeting. Over the past few years, a number of us, myself, Christina, Erica Sischke, Jeremy, and Steve, with the Terrestrial team, have encountered some of the same issues cropping up involving modeling of terrestrial ecosystems, especially as it relates to the permafrost component. And partly in answer to that, the Arctic Research Plan for the US, which we're in right now, the permafrost chapter, as well as the terrestrial ecosystems chapter, each include research objectives which are to support modeling efforts across the community, both in US federal space and among academia and other institutions. So the purpose of this call is to see the extent to which some of these issues are really common across a lot of modeling efforts. The extent to which they're pressing problems, they're really hindering forward advancement, and then finally to see if as IARPC we can help provide a platform to address these issues as a community, and that could take a number of forms. It could be a working group, it could be a sub-team of IARPC. There are a lot of different ways to do it. But in terms of what we talk about today and the sorts of issues that people are encountering with data, with processes, with scaling, all of it, it's fairly open-ended. And hopefully by the end of the day, we'll have a better idea whether or not a group approach that IARPC can help facilitate is something that people are interested in pursuing. So I can start off by giving some examples of things that we've had come up. The most recent one, in I think it was February, we had Diana Bolt-Sandia give a presentation on modeling of coastal processes, and she, like many others, have pointed out that some of the most important pieces of that, like hydrology, they vary a lot on a really fine spatial scale, and they're really hard to capture and represent well. Personally, for me, I have the same sort of observation dealing with ground ice distribution. Knowing where the ground ice is and what types of ground ice you have is sort of fundamental to a lot of the modeling efforts. And it varies so much over very short spaces that it's really difficult to capture in a spatially explicit model. So from there, what I'd like to do is find out if anyone else has encountered those issues, if they've found workarounds, what they're thinking about it, and yeah, and any other thoughts?
I agree with you that Andrew, it's Helen from UAF, that the permafrost ice content is one of the main spatial information that we need to get better at representing in the modeling frameworks processes that are critical, might not have been that much in the past, but that are getting more and more critical in terms of shaping the current and future trajectory of the landscape, such as thermocloud disturbance. And so I agree, it's an important question. Then how to address that question? Tom Douglas from the CREL, Mary Turetsky, and I have a project that's going to start this year using CREL ice content estimates in the Tanana Flats, and try to build a model, predictive model of permafrost ice content using a bunch of environmental parameters such as vegetation, composition, soil texture, etc. There is a few observations out there that, yeah, could be used maybe to build such empirical models to get better estimates of permafrost ice content and its spatial distribution.
It sounds like what you're doing is probably using geophysics and coring to, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it is at a relatively small spatial scale. I don't know to what extent this model that we hopefully will be able to build with success in the Tanana Flat will be useful outside of the Tanana Flat.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, the scaling's a really open question too. I've seen people make estimates with really big polygons the size of like a county, and then I remember when I was at Oak Ridge, what they were talking about there were much finer meshes of something in the order of a few meters. There's a ton of variability that way too. Has anyone else encountered this with the work they're doing?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're doing at Sandia National Labs is to kind of approach the problem, like let's say you're modeling permafrost evolution, to approach it not deterministically, where you have a specific scenario that you're modeling, but more in a probabilistic sense, where you're looking at the range of variability in a certain variable, like let's say ice content, and you run several realizations of a simulation and kind of look at what the spread in results are, and you could even do further analysis on that, and actually then kind of go backwards, where you look at the most variability, like which parameters gave you the biggest variability in the results, and then that kind of justifies which parameters experimental campaigns should be really going after to try and kind of reduce that range in uncertainty in certain parameters. So that's kind of one approach that we're trying to integrate with our modeling development efforts.
Okay. And what's the spatial extent of what you're modeling?
So we would like to model large chunks of the coastline, like on kilometer scale, but realistically, being limited computationally, we're kind of working on this, right now, is deciding how large could we actually model, like how large we make our domains, and then how do we transfer that, like the information on a small domain, how do we transfer it in a kind of a statistical way to a larger chunk of the coastline. And right now we're thinking about representing different archetypes. And I'm not a geomorphologist, so I don't, if I have the terms wrong, but there's definitely sections of coastline that are, self-similar. Like you have areas where maybe the sediment type is very similar, and so you could kind of group them into archetypes. And if we could get certain behavior characteristics for a certain archetype, maybe we could then kind of extend that grouping or organization to larger portions of the coastline that might behave similarly. So these are just things we're trying. We're in the early stages of kind of planning that out.
Okay. I'm kind of curious as well, given that you're at Sandia National Lab, I wonder if there's, is there any formal linkage between NG Arctic and what you guys are doing?
No, the two projects are, so the project we're doing is an internally funded research project, and right now there's no linkage to NG Arctic other than maybe we're just, trying to talk to the community of permafrost modelers.
Okay.
And we're more actually focused on infrastructure along the coastline, because the lab it's a national security lab, so everything that we do has a national security focus or application. And so when we look at erosion of permafrost, we're kind of attacking it from the position of, how does that affect infrastructure and national security?
Okay.
Can I, it's Vladimir, so I get out of the meeting so I can talk now. Yeah, I would agree with that ice content is very important, but for solving this problem of a high need of high resolution modeling and kind of technical ability, so we are actually using this we call it ecotype approach, but it's the same thing. So it's classification of land surface. For coastal, maybe it's a little bit more complicated, but still you can use the same approach. And you properly said that so there is some very high similarity of coast in different locations, but they could behave exactly the same way. So you don't have to really calculate everything in each of these points. Just if you do right classification, you can just do this limited number of modeling exercises for each type, and then you will have pretty good information about the whole thing. So that's what we apply for our high resolution models, which are doing now in the 30 meters resolution special scale. And for that, we need, first of all, we need good land classification. So ice content is one of the very important parameter, but also we don't have actually even for whole Alaska, we don't have very good land classification maps of this higher resolution, like 30 meters resolution, like Landsat scale resolution. I think that's very, very important need right now for any kind of high resolution modeling of permafrost, which is really needed for any kind of engineering, solving engineering questions or many other ones. So we really need to go to really high resolution in our modeling exercises. So that's my point.
So with regard to Vlad's point in ice content, do you think we're putting the cart before the horse? I think we need to get better superficial geology maps before we start teasing out this ice content problem. I mean, that's wrapped into the ecotype hierarchical system of classification. Is you need a good base map of soil texture and or superficial geology to actually make those ecotype maps.
That's right.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah, it sounds like a number of us have sort of landed on similar responses to the problem. When I was doing it, was a Landsat scale cell size, and when I was doing this in the Brooks Range, yeah, I wound up being the same thing. Vegetation and superficial geology were fundamental. That was part of the reason I was able to do it. Is there was a really good superficial geology map from the USGS for up there.
I was going to say, this is Erin Trosham. I've been working with the Denali Commission project on doing the environmentally threatened communities for permafrost. And this was the biggest limitation that we ran into in doing that work, is that there are no superficial geology maps for most of the communities in Alaska. And we did have some information on ground ice content. The problem is that it's highly spatially variable. Even under the 30-meter pixel size. So it varies on the order of 5 to 10 meters quite often. And so this was one of our biggest limitations, is just being able to match up where the ground ice content is high in comparison to where different types of infrastructure are.
But we have an examples. For example, the ecotype map for the entire north slope of Alaska, so Tor Jorgensen and colleagues, they produced it, and the same group produced also 30 meters resolution ecotype maps, which includes superficial geology as well for some other areas as well. With ice, there is some, well, not as high resolution map, also product of Tor Jorgensen colleagues. Already exist. It was a product of the project which was funded by USGS. So there is some examples, and it's already definitely people moving in that direction, and there is some good examples to follow. But I don't know anything about something like this for the interior of Alaska, for example. So I don't know. Maybe there are some maps, and also. Andrew, the Seward Peninsula, yeah, ecotype map. How this map is doing?
Yeah, the USGS has it. I'm not sure where they're at with it, to be honest with you. I haven't spoken to them in a while. Yeah, actually, maybe that reminds me, maybe I'll give them a call and see where they are at with that. One thing I think we're landing on here if we're going to have a community response to this, it sounds like the common need, at least right now with how people are thinking about things, is for better Landsat-ish scale, both superficial geology and ecotype mapping.
And Andrew, this is Andrew. This is Elchin. So another approach that people been using is looking at the INSAR series of scenes and then getting the idea on a subsidence, how much subsidence we have over a certain time of period, and then sort of back envelope calculation of the ground ice. So how much ground ice you have to melt in order to produce that subsidence. So that's another approach.
Well, no, you're talking about ice in frozen active layer.
Yes.
Yeah, and we are talking about ice in permafrost, so it's a little bit two different things.
For the ecotype mapping in interior Alaska, I don't know where the NRCS are at, but I've been talking with their office in Fairbanks as part of a project we have in the Yukon Flat. And they, at least for the Yukon Flat, they are very close to produce, I think a quite good ecotype map. And I think they are doing a similar effort in the Tanana Flat and other places in interior Alaska. I don't know if their goal is to cover the entire Yukon River basin or not, but they have really good data, field observation, and really good technicians to do extrapolation and map products.
Yeah, I believe there it will be like kind of peace filling process, so, and that's good. I mean, yeah, we just need to probably try to distribute information if something is like this is ready to that people should know about it.
Yeah.
Well, listening to the discussion, I wonder if, from the standpoint of a group, one action item we might be able to push as a community is the idea of wall-to-wall coverage in Alaska of harmonized ecotype mapping, which implicitly includes superficial geology as well, of course. That's something that it wouldn't be a quick solution. It takes a long time to do that kind of work, but if enough people are sort of together on pushing for it, that can get the attention of program managers and funding sources. Does that sound like something that might be a valuable thing to do as a group?
I think so, yeah. And also ice, of course, ground ice, permafrost ice, it's a little bit more, it's probably for the a little bit farther future, but we have to start to push it right now to make any kind of progress in that direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, the real end game would be able to just directly map it in some way, but I don't think anybody's seeing a really, really robust way of doing that over large areas at the moment.
Although, yeah, for the ecotype map, I don't know if it's that far down the line because for the North Slope, for example, there is that awesome map put together by Mark. Yeah. And he's gonna do it. Also, he's gonna extend that map to the Seward Peninsula, and then yeah, the whole kind of is the interior Alaska. But there is pieces here and there that yeah, I don't know. Data are coming in, and it might not be that big of an effort to put together an harmonized map. Maybe at least for land cover.
Andrew, are you thinking of this map at kind of 30-meter Landsat scale, or what spatial resolution?
Yeah, that would be the ideal. I know there are probably some people who would like it even finer than that, but it seems like a lot of things are happening at sort of Landsat-ish scale, sort of 25 to 50-meter resolution, and that'd be the hope.
Andrew, this is Seth chiming in. This is really for anyone. What's the permafrost community kind of looking at in terms of the use of IceSat-2 when that comes out? Because that's going to provide some potentially valuable information for broader scale at pretty high spatial resolution.
So what kind
I'm
of
not sure.
product it could be?
Well,
What the map of what it will be?
well, it's basically, yeah, I went to NASA's recent workshop with them, and it's basically a spaceborne lidar platform. So you get pings on the vegetation surface as well as pings subsurface, just like airborne lidar mapping in some capacity. It also has the capabilities, from what I understand, to image 5 to 10 meters into water bodies. So from my perspective, thinking about the impact of vegetation as part of that ecotype question, current ecotype, I guess that's something I'm kind of curious if people are considering using.
For land surface classification,
Yeah.
pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some type of fusion with that, getting the height information, totally help you tease apart, stunted spruce stands versus mature spruce stands and things of that nature. Something wrapping that into some type of fusion approach with Landsat data would be super helpful, I think, for getting that ecotype high-level classification to partition environmental variability.
So that's planned for launch in September. So, that's something that seems like everyone should put on their radar in terms of a possible use.
Well, I don't want to, I want to make sure we give an opportunity to discuss other things people are encountering too. One I can maybe throw out there is, the problem is kind of similar in terms of a need for more data, but Chris Heimstra was able to join us, which is great. We've had a few conversations in the past about the fact that it'd be nice to have better snowpack data, both in terms of distribution and also seasonal snowpack phenology and dynamics. And that's another one that I'm kind of curious how many people involved with modeling have encountered that as a real gap in what they're doing.
That's another very important gap. I agree. And again, the resolution should be pretty high. Well, any resolution will be helpful. I'd say like any resolution will be helpful. And that's really, pretty big gap. What we do in our models, we just calculate amount of snow from precipitation, which is kind of, well, if you don't have anything, it can work, but it's really, well, and then we try to adjust this, how precipitation will turn into snow on the ground for different ecotypes. So that's pretty much how it is done right now. So it's not direct actual information. Yeah.
So this is Chris, just to chime in quick. Yeah, so there have been some modeling efforts with like Snow Model that can aggregate that more and produce data products. And there's some of that I'm working on now for Arctic areas. And one other avenue I've been looking at is using like a worldview photogrammetry. This has been done for glaciers and other surfaces, and trying to get at that for snow-covered landscapes, doing the snow on and snow off. But then again, the vegetation issue remains kind of an unknown, and there are a couple projects that are taking off to address that. It's also one of the themes of the SnowX work that took place in Colorado recently as well. So hopefully there'll be some examples or advances in that. And so like looking at worldview stuff, photogrammetry work for even like snow off surfaces and snow off surface differences may be of interest as well.
And this is Elchin. We also did some modeling for Seward site using, Chris, by the way, using the snow model by Glenn Liston. So what we found is that when you do this sort of modeling and you use the precipitation data collected at the site, then you get your snow underestimated. And I didn't play too much with the model, but this is like an overview. Like if you do the spatial fine scale resolution modeling at where topography matters, where the vegetation present and things like that, then you can't just get that snow right.
Yeah, so the best success that I've been able to find is at least it has some, when you do the simulation and you use observations with that at different
I didn't do that.
points of the year. Yeah, that actually corrects it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That'll boost your accuracy quite a bit.
Even though like the amount of precipitation doesn't necessarily correlates with the, you know, the snow water equivalent, how it will, yeah, anyhow, we're getting into details.
But overall, it helps a lot. And part of the problem is that the precip measurements are so bad anyway.
Right.
So there's yeah, garbage in, garbage out sort of issue that you run up against a lot. So having measurements in the field that are distributed, especially at elevational areas, if you can. I mean, this is fantasy. Yeah, then that'll be way better to assimilate that. That'll help a lot.
Okay.
Is it a fairly short list of measurements you're talking about?
We actually have a bunch. We have snow depths and density, but it's for, you can imagine it's like for a couple days or 1 day, I don't remember exactly, in a year.
Yeah, by the end of the year, about a week ago, it was done for this year, for example.
Yeah, I'm talking about last year.
Yeah, and it's also very limited area, of course. Just a slope of one hill. We did also this year similar snow survey around Tulik Lake Station. There is some data from, of course, Sturm, yeah, Matthew Sturm work. So there are some data, of course, but they all limited in space. But and some limited area models are important, but for kind of regional modeling, so we need somehow extrapolate this results of this model to the much larger area, which no way you can cover by ground-based observation. That's why, well, potentially remote sensing can help.
Yeah, it seems like this is a slightly different animal from talking about ecotypes and superficial geology, since you have seasonal phenology and interannual variability with snowpack dynamics that you just don't encounter the same way with those other things. Is there anything that we as IARPIC can do to either sort of help push for a more integrated way of approaching that, or maybe even helping to translate some of what's been learned in, you know, through SNOWAX in the Rockies and other places up to a more Arctic environment?
Well, they are related actually. Ecotype or whatever, how you call them, landscape types. Each of them has a special characteristic in terms of accumulation of snow. So simply say if this year has such amount of snow on average, so it will be distributed between these ecotypes in this way. So even that will, you know, help a lot for modeling. See what I mean? Even if there's huge interannual variability in snow, but relative differences in different ecotypes in terms of snow depth will be pretty much, well, you know, stable, more or less.
Okay.
I just wanted to mention an application about that from the modeling perspective or a use of this information. And it's related to the effect of browsing on ecosystem dynamic. We know that winter browsing is very much dependent on the snow cover, the amount of snow and snow thickness. And so that's one of the applications that at least in our group we are interested in.
Well, we're moving along on time, and I want to make sure that I give people an opportunity to bring up other types of issues here as well. I remember at one point, I think Steve mentioned that he had some thoughts about some of these issues from an end user standpoint. For example, differences in data outputs from different models and what people were encountering from more the management policy side. Is that something that you could comment on, Steve?
Yeah, sure. Erin actually hit on this earlier when she was talking about the work with the Denali Commission. And, you know, specifically a part of what they're trying to do is come up with a classification system to help people in these rural communities understand the risk of permafrost change or degradation for them in terms of, you know, impacts on infrastructure or you name it, whatever it might be. They're dealing with any number of problems in these communities. And then when you step back and you look at different products that are being produced by different modeling systems, they often yield sometimes very dramatically different results. And that's a problem in terms of people buying into the science as a starting place, but also it leads to confusion in terms of, you know, which of these scenarios do we pick, or which of these perspectives do we incorporate into these decisions that in some cases have multiple millions of dollars attached to them when it comes to something like relocation. So it's a very real problem for many people in Alaska, and reconciling those differences, or at least understanding the sources of those differences and uncertainties, I think is very important if we expect to see these tools applied in the real world context.
I can't tell if someone's maybe trying to speak or if that's background noise. I don't know if anyone else is hearing that. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Well, it seems like maybe what we're starting to encounter are things that can be handled by a group in two different ways. On the one hand, there are things that can be addressed in like sort of a workshop or a working group format, like talking about harmonizing what are right now maybe slightly disjoint classifications of the landscape, and the things that Steve was just mentioning. On the other hand, there are things that really aren't solved by sitting around a table, but rather by sort of summarizing the extent to which the community wants it, like better and more even snowpack data, and pulling in new remote sensing techniques and efforts there. So I'm wondering if maybe what we're seeing is a couple things here that maybe we could talk about spinning up a working group on, and then some other things where we can try and sort of, I don't know, all get our names on or the project titles on that we're working on to say, yes, this affects us too. We need, you know, better data across the board. Yeah, it's a little tough on the fly to sort of try and summarize this and think about what we can do as a group to help solve the problem. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do, Andrew. This is Erin again. So one issue that we run across is that is an issue of scaling. So when we're trying to do things at the local level, as Steve mentioned, although it's great to have a map of all of Alaska at 30 meters, it's just not fine enough around communities when we're more concerned about thermokarst on a trail, or looking at like degradation around individual polygons or things like that. So I think it's important to be cognizant when we're talking about ecosystems about where and what we want our work to be extrapolated for. And absolutely, there's a lot of value in understanding these large-scale ecosystems. But in my opinion, it's also been a detriment in some ways in trying to have a lot of the focus on covering these large areas. It makes it very difficult to use those products for the small scale applications and to get buy-in. And in particular for infrastructure projects, the data is simply not very useful. And so that's something to be keeping in mind, is that when we're trying to look at translation and transferability, is to recognize what some of those limitations are. And if we can't address them necessarily at this point, at least acknowledge that they exist.
Yeah.
Well, I would somewhat disagree. I would somewhat disagree with that. 30 meters, it's already very high resolution. So I'm sorry, there's background noise of people coming out of the meeting. But what exactly the same landscape classification approach, plus maybe some manipulation with surface conditions, will help address exactly these very specific problems. So for example, you mentioned these trails. Well, we can actually model these trails as a disturbance, and how this disturbance will impact of different permafrost and different ecotypes. It's just a matter of, putting, rightly surface conditions, and you will get this result or impact of this trail on different ecotypes. And then you can just simply say, well, if you put this trail on the map, you will have this process going on along this trail. It's just an example, but exactly the same approach with ecotypes. You can go as small as the finest scale as you need, because you can treat, you said polygons. Sure, the center of polygon is one type, the trough is another one, and you can do it, just continue to get deeper and deeper in this fine scale. So I think exactly the same approach can be used to address those questions. But as a baseline, if you don't have this ecotype map in natural conditions, you cannot do too much. That's the point. If you have, then you can go in further details and see impact of each actually infrastructure if you need. You go in that direction. But as a baseline, as a base kind of knowledge about behavior of permafrost in warmer climate, you need to have this baseline.
This is Jeff Curry from DOT. I kind of agree with both of you, but to Aaron's point, I agree with that from an infrastructure standpoint. When you're looking at placement, knowing what will happen is one thing, but knowing where it is and how to avoid it or to go around it is, I think, kind of the point, or knowing that something is on top of a vulnerable spot. Is there any potential for the Denali Commission study to do some localized high resolution mapping around some of the more vulnerable communities?
Hey Jeff, this is Erin. No, we're not going to be doing that, is my understanding right now. So we focused on doing the assessment of all of the communities, and we're wrapping up the data collection part of it right now. And we haven't focused in on one to do a high resolution study like you're recommending. But Vladimir's group has done that for some of the communities in Alaska. And there are also some really good examples of the Yukon as well for their surface hazard mapping program.
That's good. I know that a lot of the data that, or at any rate, some of the data that you have is DOT's entire database, which is accurate where it was sampled, but is not necessarily at all reflective of the community infrastructure. A lot of it's based on material sites or where the airport is, which it's only good for where it was taken.
If you don't have way to upscale it, and that's where ecotype goes on. See, if you have the same surficial geology, so you should expect that, if you know where it is, so if you have information from airport side, but you know that under your structure of interest, it's about the same conditions, so they can use this. If you know that it's different conditions, then you also know that you have to get some information, additional information to do this modeling. See, that's kind of, we are talking about the same thing, really. but in a way that we really need this high resolution information, especially around the places where people live. And for that, of course, it needs some additional efforts and money and everything. And I don't know if it's available for anytime soon. But the way how to do it is, well, more or less clear. And as an example, especially for you, Jeff, I would say, well, we did this 30 meters modeling for entire North Slope of Alaska. So what we do also as a kind of side modeling efforts, so we put, say, 2 feet of gravel on the entire North Slope of Alaska, and we'll show you what will happen to permafrost if you will just do that, or 4 feet, or say 9 feet, or something like this. And it's all possible to do it even if you don't know where exactly your infrastructure will be, but at least you have some preliminary idea what generally impact of your, well, in our kind of understanding, it is disturbance, what kind of disturbance you will expect on the surface, and how permafrost will react. So it is all, it needs some work, of course, but it's at least we know how to approach it, I think.
Understood. Thanks.
Well, at this point, I'm starting to wonder whether or not anyone on the call today would be interested in being on a working group to address any of these issues, and if that's something we can support through IARPC. Is there anybody who'd be interested in being on sort of a continual working group on trying to push forward the idea of harmonized ecotype mapping for Alaska?
Hey, Andrew, this is Neil. Sure.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure we need to do a full survey right now to find out, who's going to commit or not. It's not like that either. But yeah, a couple of different things have come up. Aaron brought up scaling, and I think that's something that there'd be enough people interested in. That could be a continuing thing too. And we're starting to get a little late in the hour, and I really would like to open it up to anyone else to bring up any other sort of issues they're dealing with in modeling efforts, either from the standpoint of processes or data, interoperability, anything like that. Okay. Yeah, well, if that's the case, I guess the next thing to think about is or next steps. Where do we go from here? That's an open-ended question. We didn't have a preset plan for this webinar as to what the outcome would be. And as IARPC, we can support things like webinars. If there was a team or a working group, we can give that a web space, a place for people to communicate, share data, share ideas, announcements and stuff like that. Or down the road, it's not like IARPC has funding to support workshops, but it's a good platform to get people together to find the money to support workshops and things like that. So is there any agreement that there is a value in a community approach to these issues, or are we not there yet?
Andrew, I'll chime in just from a field-based approach. I'm a field geophysicist, so I spend most of my time in the field collecting field data sets, and I guess trying to figure out what field data sets are most valuable, most appropriate from a modeling perspective are kind of my interests. So I would be certainly interested in teaming up on a kind of a committee working group.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's one of the effort that I think also is very valuable is to put together, and that answers Steve's mention about the model uncertainty that can be quite large, especially if you look at the future projections. And a way to decrease that uncertainty is basically to do more and more data simulation, rather through model validation, model verification, etc. And there is efforts. I know of one from the Permafrost RCN to do a big database that collect available field observation that can be used by models to improve their projections. And I think these efforts of basically centralizing available field observations or remote sensing observations is extremely valuable.
One thing I'll point out is that Amy Breen just contributed by the chat window that evidently there's currently an Alaska Geospatial Center vegetation terrestrial working group, and they're actually addressing a statewide vegetation ecotype map now. Parker Martin, who I remember from years ago, is evidently leading that one up. He's with the Park Service in Anchorage. So that may be something we can connect with to help push things forward too.
Putting this all together, it seems to me that we're moving toward two separate working groups here. One might be a group focused on the data input needs side of things, and then the other one that focuses specifically on applications and might look at ways that we can reconcile modeling efforts at different scales to the needs of communities or DOT or whatever it might be, as well as addressing or coming to grips with the uncertainty associated with these models. So that would certainly be something that I would be interested in, and I think that we could find a number of people that would be interested in contributing to that.
Okay. So maybe what we should do is, since we had no idea where this discussion was going to go today, so I think between the team co-leads and whoever else wants to give it some thought, we'll see about developing these ideas a little bit further and give it a few days to, think about the best ways to make that happen. One thing we want to be able to do too is give people a chance to update us on what it is they're working on, not necessarily germane to the specific conversation, but just where they're at in their own research, and if they have any either meetings or events or papers or anything like that coming up. So we can do a quick member update session here. Does anybody have anything they'd like to announce or share?
Well, I think I can say about this product, Google type map, interactive map, what we are working right now, and several of you know about it. Steve knows about it, but it will be probably ready pretty soon for public to look at it. But of course, it's a product in development. So what it is, it's so far it's only North Slope of Alaska permafrost map, which is available for, well, you can look what it produced in for the past 100 years and the future up to 2100 according to two different climate scenarios. It's based on ecotype approach and actually a combination of ecotype and superficial geology, of course, and the model forced by these two scenarios for the future. So it as an output at this point. And at this point, it's 700 meters resolution, but it will be 30 meters resolution pretty soon. It's already available. You can look at how it looks like now, but it's not finalized yet. And like I said, it will be in development. And then you can look what kind of outputs at this point is temperature, minimum temperature at 2 meters, active layer depth, and also development of a thallic, kind of widespread thallic, horizontally oriented above the permafrost. And then there is some, so far it's just to show what we can do with applications. So there is some chance to choose for user the natural conditions, or with gravel on top, or additional surface vegetation on top. So it's just, you can look at it. The address is very easy. It's permamap.gi.alaska.edu. You can look how it look like. It's not final product, and it will be, well, it will be probably more or less in final stage, maybe in a month, but we will still continue to add some more areas as you know, on the way, and we will be very, very interested to participate in this second type of working group to see what kind of information communities will be interested to get from this kind of product.